And we're live. This is Austin Mackle, an important call associate with Mark Moeller, our super patron. Just to provide a bit of framework for anybody watching this, important call is, a revolutionary, one of the many revolutionary media projects happening around the world at the moment. We think revolutionary, of course. One of the elements of it is that we want the patrons, i.e. the people who donate, to have an active say in how the organization proceeds and what kind of stories we cover and stuff. We're in the process of building up software for that to allow the control to be sort of formalized and systematized. But at the moment, we're keeping it fairly casual. One of the reasons is we only have about 10 or 15 patrons in total, and only one of them, Mark, so far has actually been sort of taking that active role that we were hoping for. That's not so bad though, because if we have 100 patrons, then we have 10 participating. And if you have, 1,000, you've got 100 and so on. And that's enough to sort of help keep us in check and make sure we're not becoming too sort of focused on issues or taking approaches that our patrons don't approve of. So yeah, today we're going to be doing a general check-in with how the project's going, and also just talking about life, the universe, and everything, and how our project plugs into that. Mark, how are you? Tell everyone where you are and what you're up to start with.
At the moment, I'm over in Utrecht in the Netherlands.
Ooh.
Which is a kind of countryside for me, to be quite honest. It's a bit like a small village. Compared to Amsterdam and Glasgow where I was before. Sure. And I'm busy myself with kind of reading, writing a little bit as well, but yeah.
Busy with what, sorry?
I'm reading quite a lot and trying to read a bit more.
What's the, when you say reading, you mean books or mainly just blogs and articles?
Mostly news, yeah, to be honest. I've kind of given up on the books for a little bit, and I'm just kind of trying to catch up on the Antifa and anarchist kind of side of things. Okay,
so that's probably, you've got a long time interest in sort of anarchism and horizontal, non-hierarchical organizational structures.
It's something that I came into, yeah. To be honest, I came from a kind of Marxist background, and that was me for quite a number of years. But I got a little bit disappointed with that because it just didn't turn out as it should have. And at some point or another, you kind of realise that hierarchical structures reinforce their own systems. They come from a system and they reinforce that system. And you have to reach out at a certain point to something that is against hierarchical structures and that is more, as you say, horizontal.
Yeah, see, this is one of the sort of big problems I think with the left-wing movement is this sort of, we end up falling back on the same structures that are used by the establishment and by the people we're trying to tear down, and in that process we end up looking more and more like them. And one of the reasons IC was set up was a bunch of journalists trying to build a media organization that reflects left-wing values internally, not just externally. I know plenty of left-wing places, their output is left-wing. But they are run by, one or two people who are the owners, and they decide everything, and it's a complete command control fiat organization, which much internal debate. Sometimes it's worse than the big corporate ones because there's not even the scrutiny on these organizations that there is on like large scale government or corporate organizations. They're not worried about anyone talking crap because the left kind of closes ranks and protects these organizations as well. So anyhow, that's one of the things we're sort of experimenting with. Cool, but it strikes me like one of that it's not a simple thing to do either, because you want structure, but you don't want hierarchy. You know, you want some sort of ability to organize without devolving back to a top-down command control system. I mean, there's this studies of networks, you know, network speeds, and there's, you know, whether you have a flat network where all the nodes connect to the node next to them, very symmetrical network and very equivalent. Those networks actually function slower than sort of messy networks that have big hubs to route things through and sort of long string connections from one side to the other. There's a bunch of reasons to sort of, I think, worry that completely horizontal structures are sometimes in danger of being predated on by more hierarchical structures, which can be more aggressive and sort of move more swiftly. Is that something that you'd agree with? I mean, you're sort of in IT and networks for a living. Does that make sense what I'm saying, or is it a bit of an oversimplification?
It does, yeah. To an extent, you talk about horizontalism, right? But at some point, you have to have a structure. You have to have a hierarchy. Now, what that hierarchy depends on is authority, and the authority has to come from being granted rather than being a strict structure. It has to come from something that is from the base up rather than from the top down. And that is the big mistake that Marxists and Trotskyists on the left make, is that the structure is entirely top down. It's based around the notion of a central party. It's based around the idea of those that are in the know, those that have read enough books, and those that, you know, are writing the pamphlets, and everything else pours down to the lower echelons. And what you really want is a hierarchy that comes from the bottom up, where the individuals create choices and say, okay, I accept this person in this individual circumstance to do this job and to take charge of this particular project. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we try and embody that. For example, when we have more funding, when we have enough funding to actually fund stories, which is, of course, the key thing, what we're going to be doing is every month, let the journalists put out which stories they want and what the budget they need for those stories is, and have the patrons, yourselves, vote on which stories get funded. This is obviously for longer term investigative stuff. We're not going to try and beat the BBC or Al Jazeera to breaking news. We're going to be working on slower paced work, which will hopefully be relevant for a longer time as well. We think a lot of the stuff we do will be slightly evergreen. But anyhow, the point is that the voters, the readers will choose the stories and choose which journalists get funding, and the journalists will be the ones who elect the editors who work on their stuff. And even the relationship between the editor and the journalist in the workflow isn't one where the editor has the final say. The idea is that they have to work on the article till they both agree that there's a consensus that the piece is good. And if they can't reach that consensus, they broaden the discussion and include other associates. So these are sort of basic ways we're trying to keep the editors from becoming sort of dismissive. And a key point of that is actually to make it a bit of a closed ecosystem. Like, we don't take any freelance work. That's one of our key principles, because once you open the door to freelance work, then the editors have thousands and thousands and thousands of journalists to choose from. And they can just ignore, you get this situation that a lot of us in Important Cool were in before, where you're fighting to even get the editor's attention and get them to take you seriously. And when you're in that position, you're hardly going to argue with them and make a fuss when they change something in your article, because they'll just ignore you and move on to the next, of the thousands of willing contributors. I mean, that's basically the story of my career. I argued with too many people and don't even bother getting in touch with them anymore. But I think that's vital, because when you bring that sort of authoritarian, shut up and do what the big dog says thinking into the realm of, you know, reason and argument, it's cancer. It's the opposite of what you're trying to do. You're trying to create the free exchange of ideas where the best ideas win. And when you have a situation where one of the people has authority over the other, you can't have that. You know, there's no free debate between a prison guard and a prisoner. There's no free debate between a boss and an employee, as my numerous firings will attest to. Yeah. Anyhow, but one of the, and as well, one of the key things, I thought we might give people a sneak peek at Gurgaon Zone, which is where which is one of our pieces of software. This will be the first time that it's been shown outside the group, for anyone who's curious. This is one, like, I think a lot of people would look at Important Cool and think there's not much going on because we're not turning out a huge number of stories. One of the problems is that I've been blocking everyone up, me and other people in the group who are really caught up on the journalistic procedure part of it, how we're trying to change journalism procedure and make the investigative process more transparent and accountable. That we have been saying, no, people can't just publish stuff. They have to have this body of evidence of research and this body of research work to publish with the story, which we're calling artifacts. And that everyone's had to go and do that manually, right? So if you look at a piece, one of our stories, you'll see down the bottom this list of artifacts. Each of those have to be uploaded manually and curated manually, almost like another story. And so what we're trying to do, what we're hoping to do is get a piece of software which will streamline the process and show what everyone's doing. And I'm going to go to screen share now. And here we are. This is what we've got so far as the basic. This is up on GitHub. It's open source. And if you see, we've got above the story, where after the slug line here, we've got this section here, which shows breakdown, 2 hours of field work from 3 artifacts. And it shows that the journalist has done, work in the field to justify the story that they're doing. And if we can click through to see them on a timeline here. Google document, audio interview on the right there, and down the bottom, a video. So ideally, when it's done, patrons or the general public will be able to go to a story, and then once they see the story, even before they read it, if they like, click through and see how much work actually went into it. And one of the great things about that, it would show, 2 hours of work, and it documents the amount of time that was put into research as opposed to writing it. And one of the great things about that is that something like 80% of the stories churned out by corporate media would say between 5 and 25 minutes for research time. There would be almost no research. What they're doing is working from a press release and Wikipedia a lot of the time to pad their stories out. And so people would see that and not bother reading it, is the aim. A lot of these stories would simply not be published because the journalism would lose some of its appeal when you're expected to, and here we go, here's a playlist. The idea is as well that the documents can be done in a playlist. And now, I don't have it handy here. Anyhow, this, that's not actually one of our playlists. It's just one that Mohammed, our coding guy, has plugged in to make to use as an example. I'm going to shut that down now, and there we are. I'm back. See, so that's where that's at, and that's taken ages because we had all these journalists and no technical people on the team, but now we've finally got we had people with journalists with some technical abilities on the team, and we also had an archivist, a professional archivist, who's been sort of guiding the process, and who's like guiding how we're going to store all these artifacts and how they're going to be searchable and referenceable, and possibly using, do you know the blockchain system?
Blockchain? No, I'm not aware of that.
It's a system of peer-to-peer verification that uses some of the same systems as a Bitcoin. It uses the same sort of mathematics as Bitcoin, where you can confirm a transaction has taken place independent of any sort of authority. It's not stored. It's not, you know, it's not, there's not some central authority, central storage place which keeps track of all the artifacts, which we could then go in and fiddle around with and change, you know, who controls the past controls the future style. It's something where it's stored sort of out there in the open web, and you have to and it's got multiple backups. I don't understand the technical side of it.
Right.
I have to admit.
Signing a document. So you're saying that you can say, okay, this is the document as it was at that point in time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if you try and change it, you have to sort of be able to go out and change it everywhere at once, which is impossible. So you have a solid bit of verification on that this interview was uploaded at this time by this person. This is what it was like. So that there's this sort of irreversible history of the sort of research work that goes into the story, and that's going to be, ideally, that's going to be able to be interrogated by the. Sorry,
you touch on the history there, and I think that's probably one of the key things that people should know about, is that you're looking to create not just an end piece, not just a piece of writing, but also to show the history of where it came from, and to show the source. And that's an essential part of what you're trying to do, I think, and it's something I'm really interested in.
Absolutely. Like, for example, a while ago, there was this story that came out in one of, you know, these awful British newspapers. I don't remember the name. I don't want to. One of these terrible British papers put out a thing saying Edward Snowden has endangered the lives of field agents, say sources. And there was nothing else to it. There was a secret source who the guy can't identify, who'd said this was the case. That source hadn't offered any proof, hadn't offered any reason to believe them. Right, had just said that this was the case, and the newspaper has literally just acted as a mouthpiece for authority and repeated the claim. You know, it says it 4 times in the article or something that they're now in danger, right? But doesn't
that kind of execute flame type thing, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing could be reduced to a statement that they heard. You know, like that. And a lot of the time, if you had the press release, a lot of the time it's not even secret stuff. There's a press release and there's an article. And if you had the press release and the article next to each other, you'd be able to see that they're basically identical a lot of the time. You know what I mean? That they've tacked in one paragraph or something that wasn't in the original press release, reworded a few things, but it's the kind of stuff that wouldn't pass a university plagiarism test. You know, it would be considered not real work in an academic context. So why are we allowing it into the public debate? And so that's that project's been slowly trucking along, and we're hoping now that we've got that up, that it's actually we've actually got a bit of software to show people that's going to get us some access to maybe some grant or grant funding or something like that to develop the stuff. We don't know, but it's. Now that we have a bit of software, we're in a better position than we've been so far, and it's very encouraging for us because, you know, it's been a huge amount of work, which isn't obvious on the outside, right? Largely, a lot of it's recruiting work. You know, it's a good thing I wasn't born into a religious family, because I would have been a fantastic evangelist going around knocking on doors, which is basically my role in this project, is trying to find people who are actually skilled enough to do the things that we're dreaming up. So anyhow, there is progress happening. The money that you and the other patrons are giving is going to changing the media, changing the world as promised. So that's the update on everything internal. How you know, do you have any constructive criticism or thoughts going forward on that?
Well, I think where you're going to is great. And one of the things that is key is not to take the pace up too much, because you've got to progress, and what you're developing is basically a new idea. So it's not something that you should kind of push the pedal down to and keep on accelerating. You've got to take the pace a little bit and draw back and say, okay, right, did this work? Did this not work? What are we going to do next? Can we go back and change things or not, you know? And that's one of the key things, really, is to say to yourself, okay, that didn't work so well. And admit that to yourself and say, right, let's have another look at what we're doing here and try something different, you know, because, yeah, you're on a new path, and that's not always going to be easy. But it's very easy to slip into this kind of gear of saying, well, we know what we're doing and we're doing it right, and let's just plug on forward. And that's not always the case.
Well, one of the good things about a democratic structure is it makes it hard for that to happen, right? A lot of people have filtered through the organization, come in and dropped out. And if you ask them, first thing they'll say is the reason they left is because Austin's an asshole, and he's yelling at everyone, and he's the boss, and it's not really democratic. But actually it is, because if I'd been in charge, we wouldn't have even gone live yet. We would have been waiting till we had this software to go live, which would have been a terrible idea, because we never would have found the people who've done it for us without going live and expanding our visibility in that way. And we also, you know, for example, I've Andy, one of our members who's still, like, he's someone who I had a fight with and who ended up getting the votes on his side and staying inside the organization. So we have a very democratic procedure, and that also opens it up to, you know, this kind of painstaking debate, but which is necessary if you're trying to do the really important foundational work for you know, creating that's one thing as well, as we've spent years on this already, and it looks like we're producing an article a month on a WordPress blog, which doesn't seem very impressive. But what we've been doing is laying the foundation for a new media institution that functions differently. And you know, the hope is as well that that new media institution will produce, you know, new outlooks on world events, which I think are also badly needed. One of the things that you're seeing now is it's very difficult for people to get beyond debates that, to me, feel like they're kind of out of date. You know, there's the expression that you're always fighting the last war. It's a little bit like we're always trying to stop the last war. We're still a little bit behind the times, and I think there's a couple of that if we could open up the debate at the level of commissioning and where the stories are, that we'd get some fresher angles on things. I mean, and I'd be keen to see, you know, what you think what's lacking in the media debate today. You know, we were also hoping to discuss in this, you know, the sort of reform versus revolution dichotomy and how that plays out on the left. And, you know, obviously important cool is trying to transcend that debate and have a revolutionary / reformist institution. So anyhow, I mean, I know that, you know, one of the things that that you're very critical of is the left's view on Syria. And, you know, I think you're right in that sense, because it's really sort of, people are sort of folding into camps in a very sort of Hungary 1956 kind of way, and defending Russia's intervention while decrying US intervention and so forth on Syria. I mean, well, to narrow the question down, are you seeing, what's the best reporting you're seeing on, say, Syria or one of these issues?
It's coming from local people. And this is one of the things that the left is really missing out on. And it's the reason that they're looking to Russia, they're looking to the US, and they're criticising their own governments. They're not listening to people. And that's where the best reporting is coming from. It's coming from people on the ground. It's coming from ordinary Syrians. And if you look at Ukraine, it's the same story. But when the left looks at Ukraine, it looks at the communist parties there, which they think are of the left. And basically that's not true. The whole left-right issue in Eastern Europe is completely out of sync with what we think about the left and right. And yeah, with Syria, is essentially we're missing the story of ordinary people. And the left is looking to authority. It's looking to one world power or another, rather than actually looking to what it should be doing, which is trying to build solidarity with ordinary people and ordinary movements. And where exactly did the idea of having an international go? Where did the idea of international solidarity go? When all we can do is look internally and criticise our own governments, when really what we should be doing is building solidarity with movements across the world. This is one of the key things to me.
Well, I mean, when you ask where did the idea of an international go, I'd say, you know, to the Gulag somewhere in a Stalinist purge, or underneath the tank in Hungary in 1956. You know, there's an argument that, you know, the left lost better part of a century backing an essentially authoritarian argument. And I mean, it's interesting when it comes to Syria and Ukraine. I'm sure that you and I would take a very different approach to Chomsky than Chomsky does. Chomsky basically says, focus on what your government's doing wrong. Don't focus on what the Russian government or anyone else is doing wrong, because your government's the one you can have the most effect on. I think he's missing some of the dynamics of how the media and civil and society works in an increasingly globalized society to some extent. But also where he would agree with us is he has a great line. He goes, look, what you had for the Cold War was the two most powerful propaganda machines in history, both saying that what's happening in the USSR is socialism. You had the American system, you had the American and British, the Anglo-Saxon capitalist propaganda machine saying, that's socialism, look how terrible it is. So you don't want socialism. And you had the Russian propaganda machine, the Soviet propaganda machine, saying this is socialism, so workers of the world should stand up and defend it. So that it's very hard to escape the power of the two most important propaganda machines in the history of the world, and especially when they're adversarial on everything else except this one issue. It creates this idea that what socialism really is having, posters the size of a building with the leader's face on it. You need to have that. You need to have lots of people marching around in khaki. You need modernist art with men with large spanners and big biceps. And that's what socialism is. And I actually see it here in Latin America. I'm in Ecuador, and Ecuador doesn't get any of the love from the international community that, say, Venezuela does. When it's been a far, far more successful project, it's also been more moderate in some of its policy prescriptions, it's true, and more accommodating of existing capitalist structures, less confrontational than Venezuela. But I think that's part of the reason that things here have gone basically smoother, and there haven't been the sort of recurrent crises that have shut Venezuela down and now led to a return of electoral success for the right there. But the left isn't interested in the comparison, because here, the president wears a suit or an indigenous shirt or something like that. He doesn't wear, a flag or khaki military uniform. And, he doesn't have his fist in the air in every single photo. I mean, he does some fist pumps, don't get me wrong, but it's not got the same militant edge. One of the editors at Important called Christian Tim, who's, I think probably the best English-speaking expert on Ecuador in the world at the moment, is, he's still getting his PhD though, so no one takes him quite as seriously yet. But he said there's two leadership styles. One is Che and the other is Allende. And the people who've taken the Che leadership style in Venezuela or other places, they're the ones that get the love of the international left. And I can't help but feel that that's a reflection of these, this decades and decades of propaganda that associate sort of Soviet militarism with socialism. Whereas what I think of when I think of socialism is sort of, Star Trek, but with more free love or something like that. I don't know.
Well, one of the things that we need to talk about is the fact that Russia is an imperial force. And that's something that's completely refused by the left. The general left refuses to see Russia as an imperial system. They are quite dependent on the idea that America is imperial and that Russia is in some way this kind of white innocent type thing. And that's just not the case. As you said yourself, we're talking about two of the leading propaganda systems and major international control systems that exist in the world. And this is where we get this notion of Che and of Cuba and of the other kind of left areas, or what are supposed to be left-wing, as being in some way the right side of things, the politics that we should support. And instead, what we should be doing is looking to ourselves and looking to our own organisations, looking to unions, and to our own parties, rather than to looking at what is basically a nation state and supporting it.
Well, look, I mean, I think one of the important things is, and this is a boring thing to say, but the older you get, the more you realize, wow, you really just need to know all the details as well, And here's the thing: when I beg your pardon, I beg your pardon. When you look at take the examples of Cuba and Russia, and the Soviet Union rather than Russia, there are successes there, right? Like in terms of, if you look at Cuba compared to other Latin American countries in terms of healthcare, life expectancy, access to electricity, education, it's so far ahead of the rest of Latin America. I mean, if you put it next to sort of other countries in the Caribbean, like Haiti and stuff, you have this, awful, places where the life expectancy doesn't get to half of what it is in Cuba, or it's there are real successes inside these states. And if you look at Russia, in the post-Cold War era, when the Soviet Union collapsed, I mean, you saw this incredible drop in the living standards of people there, to the point where large numbers of people living in Russia and the former Soviet Union wish it would come back with all the authoritarian junk, because what's happened to them in the era of rampant capitalism has been so disastrous, just on the level of personal economic catastrophe. This is something that I think Naomi Klein discusses really well in The Shock Doctrine. I think her portrait of the sort of dramatic decline of Russian living standards is, I think, legitimate. But if that doesn't excuse the authoritarian elements of it. And if you take back to Cuba as the example, because Cuba is probably the example on the left that people have the most sympathy for. And part of that's, this little David versus the Goliath of America makes them an appealing story. And also, for most, until, a few decades ago, what you were comparing Cuba with in Latin America were other authoritarian states. They were right-wing authoritarian states, which were actually even more violent and repressive a lot of the time. But now that's no longer the case. Now across Latin America, in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in various places, you have democratic governments that came to power through the ballot box, maintain their power through elections, don't feel, don't have political prisoners, and don't have the kind of repressive state apparatus that Cuba has, yet are moving in that same direction of increasing health and human services and so forth like that. Point being that we're seeing, even in the context of Latin America, with the massive power of the United States hovering around, sort of opposing all these movements through open organizing, through through the exercise of discourse and democratic means, they've been able to put left-wing progressive governments in power, which are starting to do the same kind of nation building that happened in Cuba, without the authoritarian elements, without some guy being in power 50 years or 40 years or whatever it was, and then giving power to his brother or his son when he dies. This is, and in some ways it's a really hopeful time, but what's depressing is, as you said, there is no international movement tying all of this together. And I'll go further than that and say the Latin American countries don't even seem to want that. For example, they're happy to support Assad, not just Assad in Syria, who's sort of maybe geopolitically more aligned with them, but also the Saudi royal family in all these Gulf sheikdoms, these Gulf kingdoms, and Egypt, and all these other Middle East authoritarian regimes. Latin America has, perfectly happy dealings with these governments, it seems, and wants no part in their internal struggles. And that's, some of the most progressive governments in the world getting into bed with some of the most authoritarian ones. And I really think that comes back to what you're saying. There is no international progressive organization, nothing holding the whole thing together.
Oh, yeah. And if you look at what can be done on that kind of level, one great example that came up recently was in the BDS movement, the anti-Israeli movement. And that was not just the idea of a boycott, but that there were ports in the US which refused to handle Israeli goods. The union said, no, we will not handle those goods. We will not allow those shipments to come in. And that is the kind of international left solidarity that we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about unions and workers saying, no, we won't accept goods from a country which is going against our own people, which are working class, ordinary people. So, we need to reach out in that kind of direction. I'd like to go back, though, on something you touched on, which is Russia, and the notion that in the Soviet Union and that there was some kind of idealism and some kind of structure there that led to, was then broken down post-Soviet Union. What in actual fact was happening was that there were concentrations of wealth within the major cities, such as Leningrad and Moscow. But outside of that, within the regions, there was very little of that seen. What was happening in the Soviet Union was basically a very few select number of people that were being put forward and given the benefits of what they called socialism. And for the large majority, that just did not exist. And it's a real myth that we have to counter this idea that in the Soviet Union, there was a time where things were going well for the majority of people. It just wasn't happening. It really wasn't.
It's not saying that they were going well. It's saying that during the years immediately following 1989, and to some extent, that things got even worse, and that they haven't even necessarily recovered to the sort of pre-transition levels. I mean, this is, I might be wrong on the statistics, but there's what I've read, when I've read about this, people have made, should I say, convincing cases using statistics, not just sort of anecdotal evidence, but they're talking about life expectancies, average incomes, availability of, food and basic services, stuff like that. I mean, it's not to idealize or say that there was something fantastic going on. It's just to say, well, what came next was even more brutal in some ways. And I mean, if you've got a different account of that, that's something I'd be very interested in, and comes back to the point of important call is like showing the research work that's gone into a story, because I've certainly been convinced that that there was, I mean, I don't have the numbers or anything in front of me, but that there was a substantial drop in living standards on average for Russians in that, you know, immediate post-USSR era.
I'd certainly say that for the major cities, there was a distinct drop in living standards. If you look at the outer Soviet regions, places like Armenia and Georgia, etc., they actually flourished post-Soviet Union far more than they did underneath that wedge. You look to places like Chechnya, etc., and the existing Russian Federation regions, and they're still suffering the same way. And they always were suffering. They always were going through some real hard times. And what those statistics that you're talking about are reflecting is they're reflecting what was happening inside Russia itself. Like I said, they're reflecting what was happening inside the major cities. And
that's the statistics I looked at were about Russia itself. It didn't take into account if the wealth in Russia was the result of theft from the outlying parts of the sort of non-core parts of the Soviet Union. It's interesting you said Chechnya, because that also ties back in. I don't know if I'm moving on too many topics too quickly, but what's interesting, I was in Syria in 2006, 2007, then again 2009, 2010. No, maybe not in 2000. Yeah, no, I was there in 2010 again. And one of the things in the 2009, 2010 business there is that I remember I was with a Syrian friend sometime, and we were stopped and questioned by some soldier or security guard or whatever. I didn't think much of it. It happens all the time. And he's like, he thought you might be Chechen. That's why he was looking for you, because there was an influx of jihadis from Chechnya to Syria as a sort of, in the way that when the US invaded and blew up Afghanistan, the Al-Qaeda sort of went splatter and went to 1,000 different places all around the world. So you've got this effective blowback from Russian imperialism can be seen in the jihadi groups in Syria as well. There's not just everyone focuses on the US role. The WikiLeaks documents, for example, came out showing that the US was there trying to sow sectarian discord from about 2006, 2007. That makes perfect sense. When I was there in 2006, there were pictures of Hassan Nasrallah everywhere, because Israel and Hezbollah had just fought a war in southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah had sort of turned around the Israeli army, which no Arab force had done, or at least not for a very long time. And so there was a regional wide Hezbollah. Hassan Nasrallah was one of the most popular figures in the Arab world at that time. And so you can imagine, very obviously, the CIA wants to undermine that. And one of the easy ways to do that is to play on the Shia-Sunni divide, which at the same time I saw there was Sunni, I remember one taxi driver saying to me at the time, like, no, I hate Hezbollah, I hate Nasrallah, they're from Iran, they're Shia, they're the enemy, as much as Israel, blah, blah, blah. So I don't for a second doubt that the CIA and the US did attempt to destabilize and breed this sectarian jihadi monster, feed this sectarian jihadi monster. But there is also a role where Russian aggression and imperialism has helped contribute to the pre-uprising situation as well, and probably helped push and create and push this jihadi element into Syria from the opposite side, from a push rather than a pull, as the Americans might have been doing. So I agree with you very overall that Russian imperialism is no better than US imperialism, blah, blah, blah. My solution, my thinking on that is that what you need is actually a big, strong, capable United Nations that has the capacity to actually enforce international law, blah, blah, blah. That would mean that it's also got to have the UN itself has to be internally reformed. And that's why I put a lot of my efforts into something, well, not as much as I should, but I put some effort into something called the United Nations Campaign for Parliamentary Assembly, Campaign for United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. And that's the idea that you have a directly elected parliamentary body at the United Nations, which would then be the focus point for an overall reform and revitalization of the United Nations to actually enforce international law. And of course, people go, oh my God, a big, scary world government. Won't that rob nations of sovereignty? Right? And I'm like, well, it'll rob Russia and the United States and maybe Australia and Germany, or we'll lose some of our sovereign power, including the power to go invade other countries. But most countries, the smaller countries, weaker countries, will gain sovereignty under some kind of international framework where there's meaningful international law. And see, that sounds totally pie in the sky to most people. But I feel like it's important to have that goal, even if it's a long way off. And then it drives you back to, well, the short-term solution in Syria should be led by the United Nations. I look at the NATO intervention in Libya, and I don't think it's as disastrous as people often say. I say, well, look at Syria, for example, of what can happen with no intervention. And my only real problem with the NATO intervention is who did it. That it was done by NATO, not by the United Nations, and in a sort of more legitimate way, that's that kind of thinking. I know is doesn't really resolve the problem immediately, but I feel like that's where we've got to be. We've got to have an idea of how we stop not just this atrocity, but other atrocities going forward, because Syria won't be the last.
Oh, that's the idea of intervention, right? And who did the intervention is interesting, because when we look at what was happening in Syria, basically we have a revolution that was going on, yeah? And at some point there was a call for people to go to arms to defend themselves against Assad and his troops. And when they took up arms and when they did start that battle, they then needed backing. And this is one of the key things is who do you look to get your backing? And at the moment you have Russia and you have the US. You have the imperial powers, which are out to do nothing more than to settle down revolution. They have absolutely no interest. Saudi, Iran, any nation state has absolutely no interest in revolution. What they have interest in is stability. So all they are ever going to do is to try and push themselves down on that thing, on any kind of revolution, and say, okay, we want to get our bit of the pie. We want to get our slice of it. And there's no power, no state that is interested in actually taking forward civilization. There's no revolutionary state. There's no left state. So
by their nature,
where do you come to is essentially the question.
Sorry, say that last bit again.
Where do you turn to is essentially the question.
And
if
the
you're
answer,
a revolutionary force, then where do you go to?
Yeah, and there's no good answer at the moment. Increasingly, sort of people, there's an appeal to the people of the internet, but there's not much we can do about it except blog. And I do think that that's very limited, especially the way, I mean, I beg your pardon. One of the things we're trying to do with Important Cool is take a bunch of disparate bloggers who are just sort of bouncing around atomized and have them work together to build some kind of institution. It seems like a big jump from what we're just talking about to that, but I kind of feel like that's a microcosm of what the left needs to be doing, that there needs to be, the International Labour Organization and places like that seem like obvious, seem like places to start, but in practice, they feel incredibly distant from, street level activism or, workplace level activism. It's, but It's sorry. There's my wife walking in the back of the shot noise. The
there is interesting because that's one of the key problems, is that you've got these international labour organisations or national labour organisations that are completely distant from what is happening on the street and from actual activism, and that's because basically they're the same structure. They're part and parcel of the government, and this recreation of organisations and of structures that are owned and controlled by ourselves is a key thing, which I think reflects back on an important coup, because it's about creating a news organisation that is owned and controlled by the people who are interested in it, by the ordinary people. So, yeah, it relates back very similarly.
This is something I've been thinking about a lot recently as well, is like when capitalism showed up, they didn't have any marches saying, let's smash feudalism. They didn't have any, their main mode of activity wasn't antagonism with the old feudal system. I'm sure that came and there was conflict between feudal power and modern bourgeois capitalist power. But it was essentially, there was an economic transition of power from the countryside to the towns and the cities and to manufacturing, which came from the fact that once capitalism got going, once capitalism started, in the context of an overarching feudal society, it was just so much more productive and powerful than feudalism. And feudalism just became irrelevant. It became a sideshow to the main event, which was capitalist economic production. Then the capitalists take control of the state and start shaping things in favor of themselves. But that's after the mode of production has taken off. And there were technological advances, the steam engine, whatever kind of weaving loom or so forth that happened. Those were important advances as well. But there was also just a social organizational advance, which was the division of labor. Rather than having a cobbler make the whole shoe from beginning to end and take 10 years to learn how to do all the different parts, you break the task down into individual bits and you create the specialization division of labor. So someone's whole job is just nailing on the sole. Someone else's whole job is just sewing in the tongue. The different component parts are easier to learn than the whole part. So you have this new way of organizing work. That's it. Just a new way of organizing the same labor as is being done before without any major technological advances. That created an incredibly powerful engine of economic activity, right? And then you add to that the steam engine and conveyor belt and the blah blah, the various technical elements of capitalism, and you start to see modern capitalist society emerging and just leaving feudalism in its dust, not actually having much of a conflict with it, right? And that's what socialism will have to look like if it's going to succeed. It has to actually be more productive than capitalism. You have to come up with these new methods of organization in advance and, plant the seeds of the future world today, which is what Important Cool's about. I mean, and in one element, where with journalism and the entire sort of information industry, we've already got an important part of the Marxist equation. This is my laptop that I've got in front of me. For people of sort of middle-class living standards in the first world, you can already own the means of production. If the means of production are a decent camera and a laptop, and you already own them, and distribution is no longer a major obstacle, so all that's left is to come up with, or the next and most important step is to come up with the modes of organizing work and the modes of organizing productivity that we can do, which will be better and more powerful, and which will outcompete capitalist businesses. That, I think, is actually the way forward, and that's what Important Cool is a small step towards attempting.
Well, this is one of the big restrictions on where Marx left off, which is basically the idea that we have industrial capitalism and the workforce will organize because they come together within the workplace, yeah? And what essentially happened was that parties were created and structures were created which reflected not a communist idea, not a horizontal idea, but a hierarchy, because that's exactly what was happening in the workplace. There was a hierarchy. So they recreated those same structures within the party, and they tried to transform society with that same structure, which inevitably led to the same structure being recreated, just with different people at the top. So yes, the essential thing is to reimagine and to recreate how we work and how we organize and how the mode of production is going to be put in place, because that, as you say, is how society is structured. That's how the fundamental building blocks are brought up. And when you transform that, when you transform the way people organize together and the way they work together, then you really transform society. Because the transformation is not just a personal thing, and it's not just a social thing, it's a combination of the two.
Absolutely. And I mean, what we're seeing now, I feel like, is the technology is racing ahead of the, like, we have, like, 3D printing and open source software. And I mean, there's an amazingly interesting project, which I'm super keen on. It's called the Apertus Axiom. And what they're doing is they're calling it an open hardware camera, right? So it's a digital film camera, which is going to have open source operating software, is going to be modular, so you can take out bits and put bits in like an old-fashioned computer. It's got a sort of motherboard, so you can take out the sensor and put in the new sensor when a better sensor comes on the market. You can, anyhow, and it's this weird combination of a corporate project and an open source community. And the open source community existed first, and then they sort of incorporated as a company to handle the money and so forth, like that, in terms of but they're trying to build a newer, better camera. And I think that what I'm hearing, they're going to do it. They've already started making prototypes of this camera and so forth, using crowdfunding, blah blah blah. All of this is starting to happen. And so there's this, but I feel like where there's a lot of the bright young people and their revolutionary energies are going into the technological side, into cryptography, into open source technology, and that's great. We want that, but that leaves for the humanities side of the left, people like me who studied philosophy and politics, not electronics and engineering. We need to get our ass into gear and start coming up with the social forms and the modes of organization that can sort of go hand in hand with this new technology and start to create a really new method of organizing, and not just organizing politically, but organizing life itself, organizing how we distribute resources and make stuff.
Well, this is one of the key things that attracted me towards the anarchist idea away from Marxism, was that they looked practically at workplaces, and when companies were closed down, they took them over, and the workers themselves self-organized. And anarchists went in there and said, okay, we're not here to control what you're doing, we're here to help you in recreating your means of production and owning it yourself. And we'll give you advice, but essentially you have to take control of it. And this is one of the key ideas, is that you're transforming. Revolution itself is not just transformative, but the way that we work and the way that we organize has to be also transformative. Otherwise, all you end up doing is repeating authority.
Absolutely. I think there's that would be, as far as I'm concerned, a great place to wrap up the conversation, because it's right in the sweet spot of what Important Cool's trying to do. Although I guess one thing we haven't discussed is, Corbyn and Sanders, and that kind of, it's not the worst place to jump off from there as well. for example, like, Noam Chomsky, I remember I was listening to one of his talks, as I often do, online, and he's saying that, what there needs to be is a network of people who are organized in their workplaces and their communities, and that there's this large network of ordinary people involved, and then out of that can grow a political. I'm radically summarizing what he says here, and I may be not doing it total justice, but I'll do my best. So that you have this network of workplace organization, neighborhood organization, blah, blah, blah. And then out of that grows a political movement. And it's like, well, in the US, it doesn't really, you can't really say that's the case, but that's actually literally what happened with the Labour Party and the Labour movements in Australia and the UK. That there was a Labour movement first, and then the Labour Party crystallized out of that, out of the right-wing elements of that, I would say. And that directed the energy back into the formal political process. But that also led, that led to compromises from the state, like universal suffrage, voting rights for ordinary men and women, which wouldn't have happened without the entry of the labor movement onto the scene. And if we can sort of have a second wave of labor activity or organizing as powerful as that first wave, sort of around the turn of the last century, coming into the 20th century and the decades following that, which sort of helped build the modern inclusive welfare state. Another wave that big would move us into the beginnings of a really new system. The problem is that the workplaces aren't as are very unfriendly to that kind of organizing because of the level of sort of dispersion and outsourcing. And one of the things that's key to the Sanders campaign, and I imagine that the Corbyn movement, Corbynistas would be sympathetic to it, is reversing these trade deals which allow manufacturing to move offshore. Putting up barriers to trade so that, to imports and exports of products made with poor labor and environmental conditions, which would help bring the actual manufacturing base of capitalism back to the core countries in Europe, in the United States, and in Australia and the UK. If you could get this sort of labor reformism, well, that's the wrong term, this kind of labor, this new left-wing, newly left-wing Labour Party and Democratic and elements inside the Democratic Party in power, you might see a condition where what Marx was talking about with workplace organizing again becomes more feasible. Because at the moment, most of us just don't work in that kind of industry anymore.
I'm concerned about this idea that manufacturing should move from one place to another in order to benefit workers. What we should be looking to do is to transform the working conditions where the factories are. So wherever the factory happens to be, it doesn't matter. We're working people, and we have sympathy with each other. It should be the key point. And yes, you can move the factory from China through to the US, and you can change the working conditions for the workers within the US. But to me, the idea would be, let's pay the people in China and let's treat workers in China as good as anywhere else in the world. So we should be, again, it goes back to the idea of the international, that we're not talking about nation states, we're not talking about where things are produced, but the fact that we are workers.
Look, I agree, but I don't think the two things contradict each other. Like, and while the aim isn't just to function within the nation state, at the moment, that's where we have some input. As voters, we have some input at the level of the nation state. So actually another one of the important cool associates, Joey MacGyver, who writes about economics for us a lot. He's a workplace relations academic for his day job. And what he writes about economics a lot for Important Cool. One of the things he says, and I think this is a very simple rule, is that you say, well, at the level of Australia or the UK or Holland or the US, we won't allow goods into our market that don't meet the same labor standards as we've imposed here. For one thing, like, you know, you're just destroying your own industry if you allow it to compete with a less regulated industry. That's just a death sentence for local industry. But also it would mean, like, okay, so if people in China, if a company in China wants to manufacture iPhones, they've got to pay Chinese workers a decent living wage, right? That benefits the Chinese worker, but it also means that the next time Apple is wants to open a factory or expand, it's going to say, well, what's the advantages really of setting up in China? And you might see, you know, a more even distribution rather than a reconcentration of industrial capacity in the US and the UK. You'd see a sort of even more generally dispersed industrial production. So there are workers all over the world working in fairly similar conditions, right? And so by bringing in the labor standards in the first world, you're helping the workers in the third world and workers in the first world by bringing in labor standards on imports. And as you were talking about before, dock workers and other unionists in the first world can have a positive impact on that. They could say, we're not gonna unload stuff made by child labor. We're not gonna unload stuff made with poor environmental standards. We're not going to unload stuff made by people getting paid 50 cents an hour or 50 cents a day or whatever the current rates are in these sweatshops. And in doing so, they'd be helping both. They'd be helping the domestic labor force by improving their leverage, their position of leveraging, and the workforce in the third world by forcing companies there to increase their standards, you know?
I think that's key. It's not, to me, the essential thing is not that the government imposes these types of rules, but that workers themselves do. And that really is a method of change, is that unions say, we will not deal with anything that is brought in, as you say, goods that are brought in that are built or made by workers that are underpaid. We will support our people, our working class people across the world. And we will say, no, that unless you pay these people properly, we will not handle your goods and we will not buy them. That to me is the essential thing. It's not a matter of national law. It's not a matter of asking the government to impose these types of rules. We as workers have to actually create these rules ourselves and force the government to make those changes.
Well, I mean, you can imagine the disruption that something like that kind of industrial action would create, and it might force the government to put in place a legislative framework which would, you know, allow business to get back to usual, so to speak. And there you're seeing, like, in Australia was one of the first places to have Australia and New Zealand really led the world in universal suffrage, in the sense that women also got the vote very early in Australia and New Zealand. And one of the reasons for that was women were in the workforce in large numbers from early on, and the union movement was strong and was agitating. And if the government didn't act, then industry was going to be undercut by industrial activity. And so, you know, there's this sense where a lot of socialists and Marxists would see that, oh, well, that's terrible. That's the union, that's the government subverting the union movement and taking the wind out of its sails. But in another sense, it's also the union movement succeeding and having the new norms that it's trying to enforce accepted by the state, which then gets us into a whole big discussion about the core of anarchism and the state and state versus workers and blah, 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 which maybe we shouldn't get into now. I'll try and bring things back to important call in a way, and that's one thing is I know is that there is right now all around the world, there are journalists or would-be journalists writing articles about the minimum wage, including for important call. Right, we just got an article about the minimum wage coming in, and the guy who's writing it is, of course, not getting paid minimum wage. He's not getting paid shit. In important call, we try and make up for that by saying, well, he's now owner of the company. So at least he's not creating value for a business that he has no stake in for nothing. If we take off and we start and it starts to be starts to generate real revenue, he will have a vote and a say with how that revenue is dispersed or spent. He owns a section of the company, which is one way around the fact that, you know, every left-wing journalist I know is also a massive scab, right? Like, no, they don't even look at what the union rates for freelancers are. The union rates for freelancers are great, right? It's like, I remember a few years ago, I was checking for Australia, it's like $800 an article if the article is less than 1,000 words. And if it's more than 1,000 words, it's about 80 cents per word. You know, great rates, fantastic. But no one on the left is getting paid that. Maybe you're getting paid that if you're writing, you know, for Sports Illustrated and you're interviewing a Ferrari driver or something like that. But no one interviewing, you know, landless peasants in Brazil or, you know, garment workers in India is getting paid their own minimum wage. And if you can't practice what you preach, no one's going to be taking you very seriously, are they? So that, you know, this is what Important Cool is trying to do, is take a lot of these egalitarian principles that are popular in journalistic content and put them into journalistic organizations and journalistic practice.
I think that's a good point to leave on. Basically, you can't transform the media without transforming how the media is organized. And that essentially is what things are about, you know.
That's what we're about. And even though we're sort of, you know, struggling to get the number of donations we want, or even the number of the amount of output of content that we want, I'm still very proud and very pleased that there's a core group of us, you know, a dozen or so, and others who are less involved, who are still working on the concept, who are still believe in the principles behind the organization enough to keep on plugging, you know, a couple of years in now. And thank you so much for your ongoing support. All we can hope for is more patrons like you, who not only support us with social media and donations, but who can, you know, actually actively participate in discussing the project and the world at large. And we're going to be building, you know, more and more frameworks for that to happen as well.
Sounds great. Hope to talk to you again sometime.
All right, thanks for your time.
Cheers, man.
Let's speak soon. Always a pleasure.